Welcome to Chat Cyber, a podcast on all things cyber policy where we explore key issues and discuss policy strategies with industry experts.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Chat Cyber, Cyber Florida's policy podcast. I'm your host, James Jacobs, Cyber Florida's Associate Director of Partnership and Policy.
And I am your co-host, Jordan Deulis, Cyber Policy Analyst at Cyber Florida.
We want to thank you guys for tuning back into another episode. We have a very special guest joining us today, our very own boss, General Frank McKenzie. To most of our listeners, the General won't need an introduction, but I'm going to have Jordan do one nonetheless. General, we of all people know how busy you are, sir, so thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Now, this is only a very small portion of your impressive resume, but General McKenzie became the Executive Director of Cyber Florida and the Global and National Security Institute in 2022. He's had an incredible 43-year career in the United States Marine Corps, serving his country in various capacities, including in his most recent role as Commander of U.S. Central Command, located here in Tampa, Florida, from 2019 to 2022. Sir, thank you so much for joining us today to discuss cyber warfare.
So, sir, we like to start these conversations off with a segment we call Explain It to James. We think if we can dumb it down to something I can understand, some old country boy with an accent like this, then the general listener in the audience can understand it. So we'd like to first ask you, how would you define cyber warfare, and when did you realize that cyber matters in terms of defending the nation?
Well, first of all, I'm from Alabama, so I wouldn't assume that we're too far apart in our ability to understand these things. That question cuts right to the heart of it. So let me just start by saying that we define domains of warfare: air, land, sea, space, and most recently, really, cyber. And that's something that's really begun to make its effects over the last 30 or 40 years and has accelerated over the last 10 years or so to where we now formally recognize an area where you can fight is inside cyber. Now, everybody knows what it means to fight at sea. Ships shoot at each other. Mm-hmm. Airplanes drop bombs on ships. Everybody knows what happens on the ground. Armies go back and forth. And in the air, the same thing. And in space, it's easy to understand space also. We look above our heads into the sky. We recognize there's satellites up there. Sometimes these satellites might shoot at each other. Sometimes they might not. They haven't done it to date, and we don't want that to happen.
That's fascinating.
But the threat's out there. But cyber is something different. And the way I think of it is in fact a new domain. Space has been around forever, so have the other physical domains of warfare. But cyber and the cyber domain is limited only by the human mind. There's a famous saying that I like to quote a lot: the net is vast and infinite. And cyber is as infinite as the human imagination. So thinking about that, what happens in cyber? Well, as you know, in this country, many of our systems run on the internet. They run on cyber. Mm-hmm. Our hospital operating systems, if you go in to see a doctor now, nobody's writing on a piece of paper. They're all writing on computers. And that information is stored in the cloud somewhere. It's transmitted electronically. If airplanes fly based on our ability to operate the Federal Aviation Administration's air traffic control system, all of that is done in cyber. Much of what we do is in cyber today. The infrastructure of this nation depends on it. And our military equally depends on it because of the very advanced technological prowess that the United States has. Our systems are controlled in cyber. We strive to protect those cyber systems. Others strive to break into them and damage them. And that's the constant battle that you see going on. But what everyone should take away is there's a domain out there. It's the cyber domain. It's the domain that exists in the human mind. It exists on your iPad, on your iPhone, on your desktop computer. You plug into it, and things happen in that domain that have physical effect. Even if the domain itself, there's no actual physical place where you can track it down. Mm-hmm. Your server that you operate may be in Florida. It may be in Romania. Mm-hmm. It may be in Calgary, Canada. But the net itself it exists in a way that can affect actual things on the ground.
So I've heard you say before in different speaking engagements that I've had the chance to accompany you to. You make a comment something along the effects of the United States is a prize fighter with a glass jaw or something to that extent. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that for us in terms of what are our vulnerabilities that you see?
Sure. So if you think of cyber and cyber operations, what the military and other government organizations can do in cyber, you think about your ability to help your other domains of warfare achieve their objectives. If you're going to fly an airplane over a country, you might want to be able to do some things to your opponent's air defense system to make it hard for them to, first of all, see the airplane, second, process the information, third, convey orders to people who might shoot missiles at you. All of those actions occur in the cyber domain. All of those actions are part of cyber warfare. All of those actions are part of our war plans as we look to move airplanes, ships, and everything else in the other domains of warfare. So the United States has tremendous capabilities in these areas. We are unsurpassed, actually. But at the same time, we are uniquely vulnerable. Not so much our military systems, but rather, to step back a minute to what we were just talking about a few minutes ago, the complete dependence of our economy on cyber. Really, if you're going to ship things, if you're going to move things, if trains are going to run, in fact, if some cars are going to operate, you have to have cyber connectivity. So we are uniquely vulnerable because we are the most advanced technological society on the planet, and everything rides on that internet cyber backbone, whether it's in the cloud, whether you store it on your home computer, no matter how you do it, all of that is vulnerable. And we have had, at least until now, an imperfect system of protecting it. In fact, in cyber, unlike space, we're still defining the norms of behavior in that activity, in that domain. What are we going to accept as operations in cyber? What's going to be a red line for us? We know that in every other domain of warfare. Cyber, we're still outlining that, and as a result, it can be a little confusing.
I definitely want to get back to that, but I want to bring Jordan into the conversation.
Thank you. So in terms of cyber defenses, what are some of our cyber defenses? And so, for example, maybe cyber deterrence. Can you tell us a little bit about cyber deterrence, and are we using it? Is it proving to be an effective mechanism?
Sure. So let's start with cyber deterrence because it's actually the harder of the two concepts. So deterrence is a potential opponent believes that the cost of attacking you is ultimately going to bring more pain to him than he or she wants to accept. And so you do that by one of two ways. You deter by denial, which you say, look, you have a plan to hurt us. Your plan's not going to work. So that's hard to obtain. Deterrence by denial can be done, hard to do. The second one is deterrence by punishment. Look, if you attack us, you're going to regret it because we're going to hurt you so much worse than what you've done to us. And those are sort of the two ways to think about what that means. Here's the problem. In order to do that, you've got to determine who it is that's threatening you. You've got to be able to do what we would call the forensics, just like in a criminal investigation. If they attack you, understand and attribute back to them what they've done. Hard to do those things, not impossible. And then you've got to be able to act against them. So those are the components of deterrence, and we're still establishing those principles inside cyber. Principles of deterrence in ground, sea, air, and space operations are pretty clear, and we know that. But in cyber, it's just a little bit more difficult to sort of outline that. So that's the deterrence part. The defend part is this. How do you actually protect this vast network of networks that runs the United States from these kinds of attacks? Well, you would like to do it from a top-down approach that sets certain national standards for defense. We're not good at doing that. We have a national cyber strategy. It's not completely employed everywhere across the country. At the state level, we in Florida are very lucky because we've done some forward-looking things in cyber. For one thing, one of the things we've done is we've actually done it. We've sampled our environment. We've looked to see where our critical cyber infrastructure across the state is weak and vulnerable, and we're in the process of doing that with the Florida Center for Cybersecurity, which we all are a part of. And that can inform actions by the Florida government, and in fact, ultimately by the federal government, that might lead to ways we can protect ourselves. But look, these ways begin as very simple as having good passwords to log on, not giving your passwords up, responding to phishing attacks, very simple things. Because here's the thing, it's not the computer that's vulnerable, it's the person sitting in front of the computer. And so to defend against cyber, you have to start in the mind of the person that's sitting in front of the computer. We have a long way to go there.
What is Cyber Florida's role in the relationship with the federal government in terms of policy making regarding cyber defenses?
Sure. So I think what Cyber Florida can do is sort of be the bridge between what goes on here in Florida and a number of agency level organizations inside the federal government. The state of Florida does a very good job of articulating its requirements, to the federal government. We can work with some of the specialized organizations to assist in that. We can also work in policy development, and we think it's very important that we do that. But we're the Florida Center for Cybersecurity, so our first focus is always going to be the state of Florida. But the state of Florida fits into the broader mosaic of cyber defense across the United States. And as we've already discussed, actually Florida is on the leading edge of this because of many of the initiatives of the governor and, in fact, the legislature in giving Cyber Florida the resources it needs to take a look at the potential threats to the state, how we might fix those threats. Things like the cyber range are very important, which gives local communities across the state of Florida the opportunity to do experimentation risk-free, so they can test their cyber systems, see what it's like to come under attack without actually being under attack. And so we will work closely with the state, but also the federal government going forward, because this is, again, not just a problem of the state of Florida, but one that confronts the nation as a whole.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And I think back to deterrence, I think what we're still kind of learning as well is what's an appropriate response, right?
Exactly, and that's a very good point, Jordan. So, what if we're attacked? What are we going to do?
Right.
As James mentioned earlier, we have remarkable capabilities in cyber, but the response doesn't have to be just in cyber.
Right.
And so, it can be in another domain. It can be what we call a kinetic response. Mm-hmm. You could drop bombs. You could do other things. It would depend on what happens. It would depend on the nature of the attack on us, how much damage is caused. Because here's the thing, even though cyber is not what we would call kinetic, it can have kinetic effects. Mm-hmm. If it causes airplanes to crash because they can't be safely directed and used in avoiding other airplanes, well, that's a kinetic effect. Mm-hmm. And so the response that we might choose to employ might be in cyber, or it might be in another domain.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
General, this is why we were so excited to talk to you. I think you almost just answered the next question I was going to ask, but if you wanted to elaborate some more, that was one example. But what are some other examples of ways that in warfare we could use cyber, go on the offensive in cyber? Sure. What are our abilities?
Sure. So again, what you go back to is, if you're contemplating actions against a nation, cyber gives you the ability to make it very hard for them to communicate with each other, gives you the ability to shut down effectively their command and control, their ability to pass orders back and forth, their ability to understand the environment they're in. All of these things we're capable of doing in cyber. The varying effects against varying nations. Of course, they are capable of doing it to us as well, and we need to recognize that. But that's how cyber contributes. And the thing you would learn is, and I learned after practiced this for many years on active duty, when you think about military operations, you have to think about cyber at the very beginning, throughout the operation, and at the end of the operation. It is a domain of warfare, just like any other domain of warfare, and we have to be effective in it. We have to think about it. We have to include it and completely integrate it into our plans.
I was just thinking about cyber warfare, and I think it's really interesting that, like you said, that we have to think about it from the start, the middle, the end. And I wonder where, and this is kind of off script, but I wonder where does this fall when it comes to in terms of protecting the general public? So if we're going to attack offensively, in the cyber domain, we have, obviously as the United States, we're going to protect civilians. Right. How does that come into play?
So defending the nation's our highest priority,
right?
And that includes in cyber as well.
Uh-huh.
So I can tell you that as we look at and make decisions about employing cyber, foremost in a policymaker's mind, and this is made by very high level people in any presidential administration, these kinds of decisions, you're going to balance the effect against the potential enemy against the potential effect against the United States. Okay. And in particular, the effect on our civilian population, the ability of our hospitals to continue to function, the ability of our airplanes to continue to fly, all of the things we've already talked about. That's going to be at the very forefront of decision makers' minds as they consider what it is we want to do, what's the effect we want to achieve, and what's the potential blowback against the people of the United States, ultimately our primary client.
And I'm sure the civilians of other nations as well, though. Is that true?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So, the law of armed conflict applies in cyber just as it does anywhere else. And the theory being that sometimes you can't avoid civilian casualties, but always you have to maintain the principle of proportionality. The number of people hurt it has to be balanced against the effect
Sure.
that you're going to achieve. We look at that very hard and,
Right.
and very carefully, and that's a great point to bring up, Jordan. I'm glad you did. That's a very good point.
So that's in reference to nation states, which not universally, but most of the time they're going to act with some sense of rationale, like you just explained. But have you, in your experience, seen, terrorist units, organizations, stuff like that, the same principles apply, or does that get a little more muddy in how you would react to that?
Well, so the principles don't necessarily apply against a terrorist organization, which is actually the word itself describes them.
Mm.
They're seeking to create terror in the minds of their opponents. So no, those things, the concept of deterrence doesn't really apply against them. Defense does, and you can actually work that, and that's an important thing. And there's also another element, it's the criminal element.
Mm-hmm.
A vast and highly profitable set of activities goes on in cyber all the time, attacking companies, ransomware, holding companies at ransom to pay, in many cases, millions of dollars in order to regain control of their frozen intellectual property that's locked up in cyber that some criminal element's been able to do. And what we see also, and it's a disturbing trend over the last few years, is nation states actually contracting out to criminal elements to conduct these activities, which then can be harder to trace back to the nation that actually is at the root of it. The Russians, I would say, are premier in this, and they're very good at it, and they've done this with some success over the past few years.
Interesting.
Jordan, do you have any other thoughts for the general? I have one more question I'd like to ask him in relation to some policy, but did you have anything else you wanted to?
I think you kind of already answered this question and earlier, but we were going to ask if there's ever been will there ever be another conflict that does not have a cyber dimension?
It's hard to see how we could do anything without cyber.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, we need to recognize that there are weapons out there that can make it impossible to function in the electromagnetic space. What we would call electromagnetic pulse weapons, EMP weapons, that would completely destroy our ability to communicate with our satellites, our ability to really use any of the tools that we've got now. Our iPads won't work, our iPhones won't work, our computers won't work. That is a very high level of destruction, but those capabilities exist. So yes, I can foresee a level of warfare where there would be none of this, and that would be a very savage, dark, and bloody war. Mm-hmm. But we need to plan for that war because others are certainly planning for it, even as we speak here this afternoon.
Well, sir, this is our policy podcast, so for a closing question, I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, what should our cyber priorities be for this year, and specifically, what would your advice to a policymaker be?
We need to continue to improve our cyber defenses in the United States. I think that's the main thing. There are technical steps that we can do to do this. We need to rationalize these protections. We need the establishment and wide disseminations of uniform standards for cyber defense. These things are all possible. The state of Florida has done some very good work on this. Some other states have done good work on it, some have not. We're at the very lead, I would think, in Florida. But we also need to work closely with the federal government in this going forward because of the resources that they employ, the intelligence and defensive resources that only the federal government can actually employ in these cases. And I think those are actually very important.
Well, sir, we want to thank you again for your time today, and I'd like to take the liberty to speak on behalf of Cyber Florida to tell you, sir, what an honor it is to work for you. We really appreciate your time today. Jordan, do you have any last thoughts?
Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you, General McKenzie. We appreciate you joining us today and talking to us a little bit about cyber warfare.
It's been a lot of fun. This is a great organization. I'm glad to be with you on the team. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
All opinions expressed by the Chat Cyber podcast participants are their own and do not exclusively represent the views and opinions of Cyber Florida.